In this video, I'm going to take you for a little tour around the Kingston area. Here's Kingston, and as I said before, it's a limestone city. You can see Kingston sitting here in this bluish gray zone on this geological map. That's the limestone. That's way up here in the legend, number 51 and 50. This dolostone, limestone, etc. And this material reappears over towards Ottawa in the northeast. And this diagonal band that cuts through between Kingston and Ottawa is called the Frontenac Arch. It's a bunch of Precambrian rocks that are exposed because this bit of the Canadian Shield has risen up so that it has eroded its way through limestones. The Frontenac Arch connects the Canadian Shield to the northwest with the Adirondacks in the United States. Igneous and metamorphic rocks. We'll start with some Proterozoic granites and syenites. Granites are coarse-grained igneous rocks, intrusive rocks, quartz, feldspars, micas. Syenites are very similar, except they're very low in quartz, just because of chemical changes in the magmatic body creating the intrusions. And diabase are more mafic, intrusive rocks, and more fine-grained typically.
This rock right behind my head is a granite. One of the more common and widely recognized rocks. Has quartz, feldspars, and micas, and some other minerals. Granite, an igneous rock, in this case one which has come up through and displaced the surrounding material. It's an intrusive igneous rock. This one's interesting because here you can see the outline of a much older mafic rock which has fallen in to this intrusion and hasn't quite melted in and mixed with this magma. You can see the very sharp contact here with the pinkish granite and the darker mafic surrounding rock that has fallen in, mixed in with what then was molten rock and has been incorporated into this granitic syenite intrusion. Here you can see the grains inside that granitic rock, the quartz, the feldspars, and the micas. So we're up north on Highway 15, north of Kingston, about half an hour, 40 minutes, and beautiful example of a granite here. Intrusive igneous rock, coarse-grained, and if you look nice and close here, you might be able to make out the feldspars, quartzes, and a little bit of mica and some other minerals in there. There you can see some of the feldspars glinting at you just there with their cleavage. Now, much of the surface coloring here, the yellow, is from weathering, so it's difficult sometimes to see the grains, but if you reach down in the ditch, here I've picked up a fresh sample, an unweathered sample, and you can see the grayish quartz, the pink feldspars. So north of Kingston, we have a rock called syenite. This is similar to the granite, except they don't contain any quartz. You can see feldspars, those are the pink minerals, and you can see amphiboles, the darker colored minerals. And there's not much else in this particular igneous rock. This particular rock here is a mafic igneous rock called a diabase, and this rock has intruded into some surrounding granites. This is a very fine-grained aphanitic intrusion.
The sedimentary rocks, we'll start again with the limestone, and we'll visit a few sites just to the east, north, and west of Kingston.
So just north of Kingston here, and I'm standing next to some of that Ordovician limestone we've talked about so much. You can clearly see behind me the bedding planes that are horizontal, and you can see some other structures there. Those are joints we'll talk about when we talk about structural geology. So the bedding is the original horizontal plane where the sediments would have gradually settled out of the ocean and formed almost a calcite mud, which then got compressed and turned into this limestone rock, a sedimentary rock. So you can see that perfectly formed bedding plane. That's the horizontal surfaces. And then These vertical surfaces and fractures are called joints. The bedding formed 460 million years ago. The jointing is part of a compression event over 300 million years ago, prior to the opening of the Atlantic Ocean. Here's a very thick layer of limestone. This would have been precipitated in a chemical fashion, deeper in the ocean. Meanwhile, this material farther up would have been shallower and perhaps even contained some fossils. The limestone sequences in Kingston and under Kingston are very thick. And you can see here in this road cut. On top of the 401 at Montreal Street, and there again you can see that thick sequence of layered limestone, sedimentary rock. There's a significant amount of engineering involved in blasting and widening this highway cut so that that rock does not get destroyed. It's a closer look at one of the off-ramps just cut some years ago, a few years ago, through this limestone. The vertical lines you see here are the blast holes that were drilled through, and then explosives were loaded to fragment this rock and try to create a nice, perfect vertical surface. There's the surface of that limestone layer. I don't know if you can see, but there's some lines running this way, which are in fact glacial striations. So the ice would have dragged across that surface between about 50,000 and 11,000 years ago. And here we are at the Berryfield outcrop on Highway 2, looking at a spectacular series of limestones and dolomites. There's some detail of those limestone layers, calcium carbonate. Each one of those layers across the way may have taken anywhere from 1,000 to 100,000 to maybe even 1,000,000 years to form each layer, depending on the thickness. But the bulk of this material was created about 460 million years ago, plus or minus 20. Looking in detail, you can even see the bedding at a smaller scale. You can see some of the little fossil shell fragments. Limestone, sedimentary rock. All rock, when exposed at surface, becomes weathered and eventually gets broken down. You can see this limestone starting off highly intact, and as we go up to the top of this rock cut, you can see it's breaking down by the elements, by water and heat and ice, and then eventually, as we get to the very top, it's turned into soil. And that soil, over time, will get stripped by water. It becomes sediment in streams and rivers, and eventually end up being redeposited somewhere else, possibly all the way out to the ocean.
There are shales throughout the limestones. However, they're more prevalent and thicker as shale units just towards the north of Kingston. We'll go visit one of those sites now. Here you can see some shale layers by the side of the Highway 10. Thin layers of mud, silt, bound together in a shale sitting above the limestone underneath. You can see the degradation near the surface as those shales turn into clay and back into dirt. On the other side of the road, we can see maybe a little bit better those thin shale layers. It's characteristic of shale, that very thinly bedded structure, mostly made from mud, maybe a little bit of silt, compressed into a sedimentary rock, shale. So there you can see those thinly layered beds of rock called shale. And if you can pull a piece off, you can see that it's a very platy structure, very characteristic of shale. This shale is actually interbedded with some thin layers of limestone, but you can see the characteristic
shale beds, sedimentary rock.
Sitting on top of the Precambrian is the Cambrian sandstone, which is visible in a few areas just north of Kingston here, and we'll go visit those.
So just behind me here, you can see some Cambrian sandstones. Now, just below my feet somewhere here is the Precambrian erosional surface. So those 1.1, 1.2 billion year old metamorphic rocks that we're talking about before and talk a little bit later have been sitting above the ground surface for 300 or 400 million years, maybe 500 million years, being eroded after that mountain building event from 1.1 billion years ago. And then that surface now descends below the ocean once again, and now we get redeposition of sandstones 600-700 million years later. These are Cambrian sandstones. We look closely, you can see that the sandstone is eroding and weathering back into sand. You can see the grains in there. So what was once sand became sandstone, and now through erosional processes, it's turning back into sand. So grains of sand cemented together 500 million years ago, now being re-weathered and re-eroded and turning back into sand to start the process again.
Metamorphic rocks. We'll start with the Proterozoic metasandstones and quartzites. We've just talked about sandstones. Now we're going to look at the rocks that were sandstones.
Now these rocks here used to be sandstone, maybe 1.2, 1.3 billion years ago again, being deposited, and then turned into sandstone, and then about 1.1 billion years ago compressed into metamorphic rock. So there would have been layer after layer of additional rock on top of this, many, many kilometers, tens of kilometers. And then that alone creates pressure, and then the heat and pressure of a mountain building episode creating meta-sandstone. So in this case, you can't really see any of the remnant bedding from the original sandstone. That's been more or less destroyed when this was turned into a meta-sandstone, a metamorphic rock. You can see some jointing, systematic fracturing. But if we look at one of these surfaces up close, here you can see that grains of sand have been recrystallized into these larger interlocking crystal grains that make up this meta-sandstone, so a quartzite. The rock we were just looking at is actually sitting up on top of this. There's Cambrian sands, these real sandstone from 500 million years ago, sitting on top of a metamorphic rock, Precambrian metasandstone.
Farther up the road from the last location, here we are on Highway 15, you can see that Precambrian metasandstone, the quartzite, has been tilted and angled, sitting underneath horizontally bedded Cambrian sandstone. This is an unconformity running through the middle of the picture. Tilted quartzite underneath, horizontal sandstone above. This is a unconformity, a missing piece of geological time spanning about 600 or 700 million years. Meta-limestones, otherwise known as marbles, show up throughout the Kingston area in the Frontenac Arch. We'll go visit one of those sites now.
This is a very beautiful exposure, again north of Kingston, of a marble. Now a marble is originally a limestone, which again has been buried very deep, and through heat and pressure of burial and tectonics has turned into something else. The chemistry is not that much different, but the grain packing is much denser. This is a marble, metamorphic rock. If you come down in the ditch and look a little closer, you can see that the original grains of limestone have recrystallized into these beautiful calcite crystals that you can see shimmering away there in the sun. And this metamorphic rock is being acted upon by temperature and rain and other weathering and erosional mechanisms And you can see that it's turning into a sand at this point, a limestone sand or a calcite sand. This will eventually get dissolved and get carried down the ditch into the nearest creek, into the nearest river, and who knows where it'll eventually end up. Weathering and erosion taking place. There are more of those shimmering grains of calcite bonded into this new metamorphic rock called marble. Limestone was a sedimentary rock. Heat and pressure has turned it into marble. Now, this, again, like many of the metamorphic rocks around Kingston, would have been changed into marble about 1.1 billion years ago by a major tectonic event. But interestingly enough, just up there, it's capped by Cambrian sandstone, about 500 million years old, sedimentary rock. Let's go look at that. So, just climbing up on top of this outcrop, here's this Cambrian sandstone, and you can see the particles of debris and grains. You can even see bits of the erosional surface. There's a piece of the marble that's been picked up and incorporated into this sandstone, sedimentary rock, sitting on top of this marble outcrop. Sedimentary rock, metamorphic rock.
And Proterozoic gneiss, these rocks, primarily in this area, used to be sedimentary rocks of various kinds. Mudstones, shales, sandstones mixed together. They've now been compressed deep in the earth and under tectonic pressure, and then been brought back up through erosion and uplift so that we can see them on surface. We'll go visit some of those sites now.
Here's an example of that gneiss that would have formed during what we call the Grenville orogeny, the Grenville mountain building event, about 1.1 billion years ago. All of this area would have been covered in about 20 kilometers of rock or so, maybe more, and there would have been a Himalayan scale mountain range between Kingston and Sudbury. That has all been stripped away by erosion, but what we can see is the very base of that mountain, and this rock here would have been formed at great depths. This is metamorphic gneiss. Interestingly enough, up on top there, if you can just see the layers of limestone sitting on top. So again, this is an unconformity between 1.1 billion year old gneiss and 460 million year old limestone. Structurally speaking, here you can see the foliation plane of the gneiss, which creates an engineering plane of weakness when this rock is exposed. That's that overhang. And then there's two joints, one here, from much later deformation that has created a wedge that several years ago fell out onto this roadway. So that's an engineering structure that was created by various stages of deformation history of the rock mass. There's some more gneiss, a metamorphic rock. In this case, this material here used to be a combination of granitic intrusions, diabase dikes, and other igneous rocks, and it has suffered the same fate as that metasedimentary gneiss I showed you, which is to be compressed at great depth. And you can see the fabric again. Here's the foliation, this striping fabric. You can still see some granitic material here, and some more mafic material here, and it's this banding of dark and light layers in this compressed fashion as the rock was squeezed in this direction. That gives rise to the characteristic fabric, the foliation of a gneiss, metamorphic rock. Here's some beautiful folds within a gneiss. This fabric would have been compressed in parallel foliation planes and then remolded and refolded by geological pressures.
So I hope you've enjoyed your virtual field trip through Kingston geology. Nobody kicking your seat and nobody singing, "Hey bus driver, speed up a little bit." That's Kingston geology for you. A little bit of history of the Earth system.